Since 1995, the Carol Spaziani Intellectual Freedom Festival has been a staple of programming at the Iowa City Public Library. Over the years, the festival has examined various issues surrounding intellectual freedom, including censorship, copyright, movie and book ratings, banned books, internet filtering, privacy, and most of all, the limits of what is considered appropriate across various groups of people. We've assembled highlights from the past 16 years to give you an idea of how these issues have been explored. From the infancy of the World Wide Web to the ubiquity of social media, you'll see how much has changed and yet many of the same issues remain. We hope you'll enjoy.
Do you think intellectual freedom is going to happen? Is going to stay? Is it going to be changed? Is it going to be in the future? Is there going to be intellectual freedom in the future? And I'm going to start, and I'm just going to have you pass the mic down. And if you say, you can say yes, you can elaborate, however you want to answer that, and then I'll come back and give my opinion.
You are a privileged audience today. You are the audience for the first annual Intellectual Freedom Lecture given at the Iowa City Public Library. So I hope you realize your own importance.
The Bill of Rights was expressly developed and adopted to protect individual rights and the rights of minorities, the rights of unpopular people with unpopular ideas, and of individuals who were different than the majority. The Bill of Rights carves out certain fundamental individual liberties for the specific purpose of keeping those rights inviolate from majority rule. These are rights that cannot be voted away. The Founding Fathers recognized the potential for what they called the tyranny of the majority and drafted the Bill of Rights to protect against it.
The idea of freedom of the press is even if somebody objects, you still have the right to post your opinion because their objection is their opinion. And this is where Facebook may go the way of MySpace. Because and the BBC is the same way. When they had Have Your Say as one big space instead of going to the so-called social networks, I used to post on the BBC, and it used to bounce back to me, and they sent me, the BBC does not agree with this. Well, I don't care if the BBC doesn't agree with this.
Many such people consider tolerance of differences a very high moral value. So let's quit being so scared of religion and start talking seriously about it rather than just flinging around tautologies which are designed only to exclude those who do not believe, as we do, from the discussion. Talk about the Bill of Rights. There's a common, very common, rather shockingly common misunderstanding on the part of many people about individual liberty in a democracy. Many people believe that since we live in a democracy, the majority should always rule.
In the immediate days before the Patriot Act was passed, 18,000 letters were sent to Congress. I mean, it's not like Congress did not know that there were people who believed in civil liberties that did not want the USA Patriot Act passed. And the story of the USA Patriot Act's passage is a story in and of itself. We don't have time for it here, but the strong-arm tactics of the executive branch in basically getting Congress to abdicate its responsibility to defend people from a potentially overzealous executive branch, they were just cowards.
As the war began to go poorly, it was brought up in Congress that it's not the war that's the problem with the American public, it's the disc jockeys.
Like in terms of this intellectual freedom as a whole, I think it's something that we saw after 9/11 with both the Patriot Act and the Millennium Copyright Act, that when we willingly give up information and freedom, then it's more easily taken from us later on or at the same time. So that when you give all this information freely to Facebook, and you say, here, I want this to be out there sort of publicly or in the public stream and sort of exist in the public media that we're so focused on now, then what happens is you can't later take that back somehow. It's really hard to take that back and say, oh, but wait, I want it out here, but I don't want it there.
It's the TV shows. Let's find these stations. They're wrecking the kids. It's awful. Anything. And of course, there was only one congressman that voted against these ridiculous fines that the FCC can now level, because how can you be a congressman and vote against indecency?
I mean, I'll say it, they were cowards, aside from people like Russ Feingold and the 66 people in the House who voted against it, Republicans and Democrats alike. They got scared and they voted for it, and now you see that the Congress is now starting, I mean, I'll mention this in a few minutes, but one of the House committees is starting to say, John Conyers, who I believe voted against it, he's in the House, he has requested that Ashcroft explain how 50 different provisions in the USA Patriot Act are being implemented. And you can probably guess what Ashcroft's response has been so far. Nothing. He's not responding.
We've been stifled. The last Emmy Awards was edited to the point where the American public just turned it off. It was the lowest rated Emmy Awards show ever. It was censored by Fox, who of course through Fox News Channel supports everything the Republicans and the Bush administration does. That's their shtick. It's not that they really might believe that or not, but they've found a niche, and that niche is the Rush Limbaugh right wing. Let's go to the war, support the troops. Not that the rest of us don't support the troops, but we're put in a position where we look like we don't.
You can criticize the Iowa City Gazette or the Cedar Rapids Gazette, whatever incarnation it's in now. You can criticize the Press Citizen, the DI, the Advertiser, the Icon, the Register. You can criticize them all, and you can also criticize the high school press. And you know what? It's okay. But if that's okay, then it's also going to be okay for these high school students to cover the same kinds of stories, the same kinds of issues that their professional brethren are covering. That's been our point here in Iowa City. That's what's made this a great newspaper town. Did you know that Iowa City, by the way, is the #1 newspaper reading town in America? The statistics are phenomenal. It's like households average 2.4, this is statistics I read about 6 years ago, but I assume it's pretty close, 2.4 daily newspaper subscriptions. That's what every household in Iowa City subscribes to on average. Because think of all your friends you know that get a Chicago Tribune, New York Times, as well as a Gazette, a Press Citizen, and a Daily Iowan. I mean, I get 4 daily newspapers. I know I'm a freak, but I mean, there must be lots of other people like me who get a lot of daily newspapers, and they may not read them cover to cover, I don't know, but we're a pretty literate place, and we read a lot of newspapers here.
Does anybody read newspapers anymore?
Yes.
Okay.
Every day,
All right.
about 3 or 4 of them.
Which ones do you read?
I read the Des Moines Register, the New York Times, Press Citizen, and maybe the Gazette.
Do you think that in 10 years people will be reading newspapers?
I have no idea. If there's a benign God up there, I won't be around for 10 years.
Well, say about like newspapers and stuff like books and stuff, and in the New York Times, I think the New York Times is probably a great publication, but they're just like CNN. They're being controlled to pick up certain fights and stuff like that for different reasons and stuff. So I don't really like. I wouldn't trust the Boston Globe too much. But I would trust the newspaper they hand out to the Metro.
So what papers do you read?
I read the New York Times.
And
I'd say for information, the Times is probably the best newspaper we have. You don't have to agree with its philosophy, but I don't think it can beat it for information.
do you trust the newspaper?
That's a good question.
I think the newspapers. Mother Jones had an issue on, I think it was a couple of months back, had for dummies, Iraq for dummies, and it shows how these investors, so-called investors, are taking over the newspapers. You know there's not a large profit margin in newspapers, so why would a rich person buy into newspapers and expect a big return. Because the idea is to kill it. You can't go hit it directly because of the First Amendment, your freedom of the press, but you can nibble it to death until you have nothing. So you have to fight for your public access, and the reason that people don't know that Mediacom is the best, because they don't know. Some people don't even know where the library is.
And if you don't have a home in the first place, or if you don't have those sorts of resources at home, that's a place I think that libraries are performing a service that's somewhat hidden from the public. I think, or decision makers sometimes. They think of the library as that luxury. Oh, people are just going there to check out fiction and movies. When in fact we know that's not true. And we also know that even when that is true, we're really providing something to people who would not otherwise be able to have exposure to those ideas or that cultural experience.
I'm the chair of the Governmental Affairs Committee, which does lobbying for ILA, and I'm here to talk to you about the enemies of intellectual freedom in Iowa. Like in Congress, there are all kinds of attempts to infringe on our intellectual freedom in Iowa. They're usually cloaked in pro-family rhetoric, and they depict librarians as wanton purveyors of pornography to children and sex criminals. Marvin Hartwig, the vice president of the conservative Iowa Family Policy Center, writes in one of their policy papers, which is on the internet. It's a paper called "Filtering is Common Sense." Quote, "Some librarians are concerned. They argue for free-flowing information in public libraries, arguing that all information ought to be made available to everyone at any time. But do we let this concern override the safety issues facing our children?" And their answer is a hearty yes. ILA and most librarians disagree. Two things gave the self-censors out there a real push in Iowa this year. The first was the case you may remember of a little 2-year-old girl who was snatched by a pederast in the Des Moines Public Library, and then he proceeded to lock himself and the little girl in a men's room and begin to assault her. The library staff broke down the door and saved her and had the guy arrested. Right after he was arrested, the story began to circulate. I've heard that he claimed it. I've heard that the police claimed it. But at any rate, the claim was that he'd been viewing pornography on the Des Moines Public Library computers before he did this snatching. And it's just not true. The people who saw him come into the library saw him come through the library and snatch the girl immediately. But that hasn't stopped the story from being used both by this Iowa Family Policy Center to justify filtering and attempts to change Iowa's obscenity law, and also by members of the state legislature. We met with members of the legislature who are sponsoring filtering legislation in February. And one of the members of the ILA who was there is also on the Des Moines Public Library board, and he told this guy it did not happen. And the guy said, "Oh, that doesn't matter. There's lots of other incidents that justify filtering," but he could not name one in Iowa.
The other very interesting thing that we had happen was a woman who did, in fact, go to our board with a proposal that materials in all sections of the library be recategorized. Rather than being in a Dewey order, she wanted them to be categorized by mourning and grief, but not death, and parenting, but not anything that would have any kind of controversy within parenting, no divorce books or anything like that in that section, so that parents could find them. And she not only wanted us to do that, but she had an army of volunteers who would come in and do it for us. So that was a little worrisome. We let her, she came before the board, and the board talked to her and did write a letter saying that that was not something they'd chosen to do, that we would, stick with Dewey, and that was an easy way for people to find things. And she didn't pursue it after that. But those are the only two things that we've really had happen at our library.
That is utmost. That patron service is utmost in my mind. People need to be given the respect and the opportunity to voice their concerns. Lord knows I voice my concerns, political and otherwise, all over the place. And so other people need that opportunity as well. And as a servant of the community, I need to be able to listen to them.
Racial language is also at issue in a very current challenge in Atchison High School in Kansas. In fact, this book was pulled from the shelves on September 20th. It is currently undergoing reconsideration by a committee. It's a series there are 6 short stories in Athletic Shorts by Chris Crutcher. the one under issue is Telephone Man, which is a story about racism. And the racist character in the story uses racist language. And therefore this story, which is meant to teach about the dangers of racism, is being called racist.
Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was removed from a locked reference collection at the Boulder, Colorado Public Library. The book was originally locked away because the librarian thought the book espouses a poor philosophy of life.
This is another book, Doing It. It's a fairly recent book by Melvin Burgess. You can all guess what it's about. And for that reason, it has not actually been challenged. But it comes at what comes first, which is when librarians maybe don't buy a book because of its controversial nature. And currently right now in the Young Adult Librarian Listserv, there's a lot of discussion going on initiated by a librarian in a small community in Maine who has read that this book has merit in its many tales of the sex lives of 3 British high school-age boys. But because of its controversial title, she fears that she would bring upon a challenge by purchasing it. So there's sort of a layer that happens before things get challenged. And books which deal with gay sex are also likely to be challenged. The sexual content in Baby Bebop by Francisca Leah Block has been challenged in a number of schools.
Poetry, of all things, fairy tales and poetry seem to push people's buttons. And this brings up another children's author, Roald Dahl, who is a very frequently challenged author. His book, Roald Dahl's Revolting Rhymes, kind of says it all, as well as Rhyme Stew. They're very popular, they're very funny, they're sarcastic, they're satiric, and that sometimes just doesn't go down with people. You either think it's funny or you think it's horrible. Anyway, Revolting Rhymes was challenged at the Northeast High School in Goose Lake, Iowa. And I thought it was interesting that it was challenged at a high school because of alleged violence, because of the subject of witches, and because they used the word slut. Rhyme Stew was also challenged in Dover, Delaware Public Library. And it was interesting, in that particular case, they moved it to the adult section of the library. And the person who complained about this book in that particular place complained about other books too, and wanted the public library to institute a rating system just like the MPAA rating system for movies.
I found the MPAA website, and it's an interesting site for a lot of reasons. It tells you how they see themselves and how they want you to think of them. And so if you look on the site, they call themselves the voice and advocate of the American motion picture, home video, and television industries. And they also go out of their way to tell you that the current board of directors includes the chairman and presidents of the 7 major producers of distributors of motion pictures and television programs in the United States. These members include the Walt Disney Company, Sony Pictures Entertainment Incorporated, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Incorporated, Paramount Pictures Corporation, 20th Century Fox Film Corporation, Universal Studios Incorporated, and Warner Brothers Studios Incorporated. These are not 7 entities that care one way or the other about your intellectual freedom. They care about their bottom line. They are for-profit organizations.
Man, it's really hard for me to explain it. It's just so convoluted. I just know things like they extended copyright on everything, across all platforms of media. It used to be 99 years. Right, but now it's infinite, basically.
I mean, the really quick history of copyright is for a couple hundred years, basically, copyright was something that was really esoteric. It was something that none of us, people like us, ever thought about. It was copyright was just the domain of large publishing houses, book publishing houses, television broadcasters, radio networks, etc., that had the capital, the millions of dollars in capital, that gave them the opportunity to broadcast in a kind of one-way mode of communication, broadcast their messages. it wasn't until about 30, 40 years ago, with the advent of the Xerox machine, with the cassette deck, the cassette, and then later home computer technologies, that, well, copyright suddenly became a concern for more people. It became a concern especially for the companies that made their money off of delivering these messages that we paid for to consume, paid for whether in the context of commercial radio where we had to hear advertisements or actually paid for contents like books.
Still, at the same time, that poor woman in Minnesota who was made sort of a scapegoat for downloading all that music through Kazaa or whatever it was, and was charged $14 million, a single mother with like 3 children. It's that sort of thing, or like Metallica just being Metallica,
Just speaking personally, privacy of information has always been kind of an illusion to me. Like even in high school, we knew of students who would put keystroke loggers on the keyboards and hack into everyone's email accounts. And even things like personal diaries, in the non-technology, in my high school, they would raid our lockers and read our diaries and things like that. And so I'm not sure what people are looking for privacy on the internet. If we're not controlling the technology, I don't see how we can expect to have privacy.
I brought with me the text of last year's Iowa law, which says, a public library that receives funds in accordance with this lettered paragraph shall have an internet filtering program or internet filtering service in use, unless the library has only one computer designated for public use and the library staff regularly monitors use of that computer. However, a public library that monitors the use of a computer shall submit an annual report describing the library's monitoring efforts to this division. What this means is if you want any state money, you'll have to install filters, unless you have only one computer, and then I think you have to have the computer on your desk and let people look over your shoulder while you run the keyboard. I'm probably being overly dramatic here, but not by very much.
Because we really have seen a growth in the number of people who are coming here, either because they don't have another place to go, but also, more importantly, that this is the access for that inexpensive movie or other kinds of entertainment.
My basic point is that what limits our intellectual freedom in contemporary U.S. cinema isn't so much the rating system as the fact that most films in movie theaters cost at least $10 million and expect to turn a profit, and a quick profit. It's as if you imagine Kafka as a filmmaker trying to make a film of the trial today, he would very quickly be told, no one will understand why this guy's on trial for something you can't say what it is. You should make it clear what crime he's accused of committing. That'll make the film more accessible to people, and we can actually afford to make it and market it then. That's the real block, I think.
We have named the Intellectual Freedom Festival in honor of Carol Spaziani, and many of the people in the audience and myself have just come from a nice brunch where we got to praise Carol for all of her fine works, both in the community and related to the library in her long years in Iowa City. The name of Carol Spaziani and the concept of intellectual freedom have always run together for those of us at the library who've worked with her for many years. Her lifelong commitment to the freedom of ideas is something that has inspired all of us. I know certainly personally I have been inspired by Carol, challenged by her. Carol doesn't care what's practical, she cares what's right. And She insists that you do it. And I think every manager needs someone like that on their staff. And I will miss Carol, but I understand she's busy as ever out there in the community.
I haven't listened to your station for a long time for a fairly good reason. And I want to know, are you still doing that drive time horrible, horrible thing that goes on in the morning that everybody listens to but is awful?
I know, it is so awful that 1 out of every 3 people in this community listen to it.
Okay,
So it's not your taste.
Do you have any standards for what is said on the radio?
I certainly do.
Okay, what kind of standards do you enforce?
I have the standards that I am me, and I have done a radio show in the morning in eastern Iowa for over 42 years, and not only have I accomplished a lot of wonderful things for charities,
I know you have.
a lot of things for communities, but I made enough money to buy my own radio station.
Well, I'm sure you have. And
Okay, but that's the whole thing in a nutshell. Steve has a child in grad school. Steve has a nice house. Steve has a wife and dogs, and everybody needs to eat, and I've got 10 employees that work for me. I do what works on the radio. Now, you might not like it.
I'm asking you what kind of standards you have for that
My
particular drive
standards
time.
are to deliver an audience.
So you
and
don't,
if I can take,
anything goes on that channel, on that time
well, but
slot?
it's not your cup of tea, but it's still 1 out of every 3
Okay.
in the community.
I would just like to ask if you do things that defame people's character on that drive time, because
Well, I don't know that I defame people's character.
Okay, I'll give you my example, which is why I haven't listened to your station for so long.
Mm-hmm.
The League of Women Voters was called a bunch of lesbians on your radio station one morning in the drive time.
And they may have been called that, but I didn't call them
It was
that.
called by one of your staff.
I didn't
It
call
was
them
during
that.
a particularly controversial
I remember
election.
when the League of Women Voters.
It was a particularly controversial election for a county office.
I remember that, and they wanted.
And
they
whoever
wanted to
was
eliminate
on your
positions.
channel, I do not know who it was, called the League of Women Voters a bunch of lesbians
And
on
the League
the
of
air.
Women Voters still exists today, does it not?
Of course.
Okay.
I'm not saying that it doesn't, but
I'm saying.
I don't feel that that's a community-oriented radio station when you can
But it
defame
is.
characters.
But it is. When the League of Women Voters at that time was asking for positions, the League of Women Voters, as far as I
Has nothing to
understood-
do with the positions. You were defaming character.
Pardon?
You were defaming character.
I don't know
Nothing.
that I was, ma'am. That was a long time ago, and I don't know that I did.
Well,
you
and
may
that's why I
have
haven't
believed that
listened
I.
to your radio station
You may
since.
believe that
I'm
I
not
did.
going to do it.
Okay,
Because I do
but
not feel
one-
that is content that is
Well,
community-oriented.
you're not going to listen to me
Or
either.
information.
You asked me a question.
You're not listening to me. Let me finish my
I'm
question.
trying to answer your question.
You're not.
Who
doing
should I worry about you, or should I worry about you and you? Because 1 out of every 3 people in the community on an AM radio station that's in competition with 12 other local signals, 1 out of every 3 in the community turn on my radio station
Is
in
that
the
because
morning.
you defame people's character? That they like to listen to that kind of crap?
I don't believe that. I don't believe people would if they believed I really defamed character. I believe you were offended.
I was interviewed this week on a radio program in West Palm Beach, Florida, and the very aggressive sort of Rush Limbaugh wannabe type host kept insisting, you know, well, surely you don't think that children should have access to we were talking about a banning of a dictionary, to definitions of words like, and then of course he gave all kinds of words that define various sexual practices. And I thought to myself, you know, this is a textbook illustration of the hypocrisy of some of these censors, because if he really believed that these words were inappropriate for children, he would not be broadcasting them over the public airwaves at an hour when children might be listening. But that point was lost on him.
All right, we're rolling.
Intellectual freedom means that you want to express something that you feel or think, and sometimes you just got to say what you feel or you think, and fuck anyone else who doesn't like it.